When your son goes MAGA. That headline from the New York Times in the early days of 2025 would have been seen as a fringe one-off situation even just a few years earlier, some sort of strange outlier. For decades, things ran in the opposite direction, especially in the United States. It was conservative parents who worried that their kids would come back questioning their faith, rejecting their values, and voting left. Today, though, this seems to have all but reversed course. Trump carried young men in the 2024 election by 16 points, the strongest Republican showing among young voters in generations. While Kamala Harris still won a majority of the young female vote, Trump made inroads there too. In Europe, there are similar trends. Far-right parties are resonating with younger voters in ways that would have been assumed to be impossible just a decade ago. And now, it's become so common that outlets are publishing how-to guides for liberal parents trying to understand their MAGA sons. Something fundamental has shifted. The generation that was supposed to be the most progressive in history is turning into something else entirely, and incredibly, those who spent the most time with them seem to have missed it coming entirely. Rightward shift. When young voters cast their ballots in the 2024 presidential election, the results marked a sharp departure from a model that pollsters and political strategists had spent decades building. Young people would grow steadily more progressive than the generations before them, welcoming, inclusive, and prioritizing real action on issues like climate change. Even until recently, young voters had consistently leaned left. The main concerns in years gone by were that they might be too left-wing and that they didn't vote reliably. As late as 2020, they were predictably Democratic voters. Biden, hardly the personification of youthful energy, managed to carry them by double digits. The warning signs that this confidence might have been overstated, to be fair, had been flashing for some time before 2024. Pollsters were seeing the shift in real time. Surveys consistently showed young voters, particularly young men, moving closer and closer to Trump. This was especially the case after he selected J.D. Vance as his vice presidential candidate, who offered a different style of republicanism that resonated with many on the right. When the final results were in, Trump had won young men outright, 56% to Harris's 42%, according to exit polls. Several news outlets quickly picked up that he'd gained a larger share of voters under 30 than any Republican since 2008. And while men did make up the bulk of the gains, it wasn't limited to them. He made significant inroads with younger women too, even though the majority still voted for Harris. This wasn't some random anomaly though, nor, is it even a quirk of America's electoral system. Rather, this is a pattern that's playing out across much of Europe, and the fact it's happening across different political landscapes, economic conditions, and cultural contexts suggests there's something fundamental going on here. Take France, for instance. In the 2022 presidential election, 26% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted explicitly for far-right candidates, while Macron, who had long attempted to brand himself as the energetic centrist embodiment of young France, found himself lagging behind both the far-right and far-left among voters who were supposed to be in his natural base. By the 2024 European elections, the National Rally alone had surged to 32% support among 18 to 33-year-olds, a double-digit increase over just 5 years prior. It's worth noting that combining all left-wing votes still eclipses the National Rally's total with these voters. But that still is doing some serious heavy lifting here. Le Pen's party has made genuine inroads with young French voters that would have been unthinkable even a decade ago. And the maths also requires us to include those who voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, a far-right outfit that hates Macron almost as much as Le Pen's voters do. Germany tells an even more striking story. Back in the 2010s, the Greens became the de facto party of politically active young Germans, concerned for the future and demanding action on the issues, like climate change, that they believe posed a genuine threat to our societies. Today's support for tackling those issues has collapsed down to the low teens, replaced almost overnight by concerns over economics, crime, and immigration. Support for the Greens has similarly been in freefall. In the 2024 European parliamentary elections, they won just 11% of young voters, down a modest 23 points. Meanwhile, the far-right alternative for Deutschland has surged into a tie for first place, nearly tripling its share of the youth vote. When you ask these voters what their driving factors are, many of the replies are the same. The cost of living has far outpaced wages, housing has become ever less attainable, and the perception of rising crime has shifted their priorities dramatically. The German Greens collapse deserves particular attention because it reveals a massive shift in prioritization that goes beyond any single party. Climate action absolutely dominated political activism in Europe and the United States alike through much of the 2010s, with figures like Greta Thunberg named Time magazine's Person of the Year in 2019, despite being just 16 years old. She even managed to land a meeting with the then Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, where she informed him he wasn't doing enough on the issue. Fast forward to the end of 2025, and the issue is a shell of its former self. The share of Germans rating the environment and climate protection as very important has dropped by double digits over the last 5 years alone, and among younger voters, that shift has been even more dramatic. When researchers asked Germans aged 14 to 29 what concerned them most in 2024, 41% cited increased immigration and the cost of living. The shift is even less that young people stopped caring about the environment altogether, and more that other issues with more immediate and tangible implications have taken the spotlight. Immigration and the basic cost of living now compete with the environment in ways that they simply never did a decade ago. And crucially, the parties that are talking most aggressively about those issues aren't on the left. The cultural shift. An African proverb says that a child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. We think there's a good amount of truth in that, and it helps explain the cultural terrain that Gen Z walked into. The oldest Gen Z members came of age during the late Obama years, a period that felt like the culmination of decades of social progressivism. Marriage equality went from having widespread bipartisan opposition when he was elected in 2008 to being legal and enjoying majority support by the time he left office just 8 years later. The Democrats nominated their first female presidential candidate, who ran on what felt like, to many, an implicit promise that the arc of history was bending their way. Hillary herself spoke of her campaign as having offered a chance to crack that highest, hardest glass ceiling. The trajectory seemed clear: toward expanding individual autonomy, changing traditional institutions, and breaking down barriers. By the mid-2010s, the American progressive movement found itself at a similar crossroads. One by one, they had won the major battles, and won decisively. What followed will likely be looked back on by historians as the left being victims of their own past success. Fresh off these victories, they had a newfound confidence to push into territory many Americans found far more contested. Crucially, they oftentimes did so with an intense moral certainty that dismissed or attempted to outright silence those who weren't in lockstep with them. Don't believe us? Don't take our word for it. Let us know who you think originally said the following: after years of neglect, this administration has taken a strong stand to stiffen the protection of our borders. We are increasing border controls by 50%. We are increasing inspections to prevent the hiring of illegal immigrants. And tonight, I announce I will sign an executive order to deny federal contracts to businesses that hire illegal immigrants. If that sounds like it might have been from Donald Trump, we can't blame you. But it wasn't. That was from former President Bill Clinton during the 1996 State of the Union address to Congress, and it was met with bipartisan applause. He wasn't exactly an outlier on this at the time either. While the Democrats may not have been quite as aggressive on border security as the GOP, they weren't exactly lenient either. Senator Obama in 2005 went on record as saying that, quote, "We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked." He argued that in his book, the influx of, quote, "mostly low-skill workers threatened to depress further the wages of blue-collar Americans," end quote. Yet within a decade or two, positions like those had gone from being well within the mainstream of left-of-center politics to essentially radioactive. Despite his pro-migration stance, the very use of the term illegal in 2024 even landed President Biden in hot water with the left. The Guardian called it dehumanizing, inaccurate, and outdated. He ultimately had to walk it back, saying he regretted the use of the term. The shift wasn't limited to immigration either. Positions on gender and identity that had been relatively marginal a decade earlier became increasingly seen as the established orthodoxy, and critically, it seems with little concern for where public opinion actually stood. The method through which the left approached the issues changed too. It was less that these new positions were being advocated for in the public square, but rather that dissent from them began to carry both professional and social costs. By 2021, 65% of college students said that the climate on campus prevented people from saying things that others might find offensive, a figure that climbs much higher at some of the most prestigious institutions. More recent research has painted an even starker picture. Between 2023 and 2025, Northwestern University researchers conducted nearly 1,500 confidential interviews with undergraduate students. When asked whether they had pretended to hold more progressive views than they actually believed in order to get ahead academically or professionally, 88% of them said yes. It would be one thing if the people reportedly feeling this way had come to university already holding arch-conservative or far-right views, but in many cases they hadn't. These students and faculty members were oftentimes centrists or left of center, yet found themselves unable to speak opinions that just a few decades earlier had been understood as reasonable and centrist, even among Democratic politicians. It was a trend that would go supernova with one of the most contentious issues of the last few years, the war in Gaza. Beginning in April 2024, pro-Palestine protests sprouted up across universities, first at Columbia and then spreading rapidly to dozens of some of the nation's most prestigious institutions. They went beyond merely holding demonstrations too. They began to occupy entire buildings and barricade themselves inside, demanding that their universities divest from Israel. As the scenes intensified, several switched to remote-only classes and partially closed their campuses. Columbia went on to cancel their graduation ceremonies entirely, creating the feeling for many that they were losing control of the situation. For the seniors that year, the disruption was particularly cruel. The college class of 2024 had been the high school class of 2020, the students who had all of their senior proms and graduations cancelled because of COVID. And after getting through all of that, they ended up missing their other graduation because of the radicalism of a small percentage of their classmates. Into that void stepped conservatives with a message that really did start to resonate. Texas Governor Greg Abbott was sending state troopers to clear the encampment at UT Austin within a matter of days, and many other Republican politicians were pushing for restoring order on campuses. The irony of all of this really should hit home. Gen Z should be a natural constituency for the left. And yet, here we are. But cultural issues are only half the story as to why the young have been moving right. The economic foundation. On paper, this generation has every reason to be the most left-leaning in modern history. They're the most heavily impacted in terms of student loans and the cost of living. Perhaps unsurprisingly, recent Gallup polling has shown that net favorability of capitalism among those aged 18 to 34 in the United States has swung from positive by 46 points to negative by 11 points in the last 15 years. And to that point, economic progressivism has shown some genuine buy-in with the group, from the consistent backing politicians like Bernie Sanders enjoyed, along with more recent rises like that of Zoran Mamdani in New York. The economic frustrations driving that aren't new, though. They've been building for well over a decade. Sanders' rock star status dates back to his 2016 presidential bid. He absolutely dominated with young voters in the Democratic primary, trouncing his opponent Hillary Clinton with numbers like winning the under 30 vote in Iowa by 84 to 14. The field was larger when he ran in 2020, but he nevertheless still did extremely well with younger people that time around too. His message clearly resonated. And that's where this starts to get weird. None of the indications we see show young people moving in the ultra-free market direction of the past generations of conservatives in the United States. Quite the opposite, actually. By all accounts, they seem to be moving rightward through a combination of disapproval of current left-of-center politicians, who they believe to be out of touch and ineffectively delivering meaningful reforms in spite of the right's traditional economic policies, not because of them. The frustration runs deeper than any single policy or administration, though. This is something that, especially in the States, has been generations in the making. Growing up, Americans are overwhelmingly taught that the formula to success is quite clear. Stay in school, get a degree, work hard, and economic prosperity will be yours. Gen Z followed that script to a T, taking on unprecedented amounts of student debt to afford their degrees, all while being told that it was positive debt. The average borrower now graduates with around $40,000 on their balance sheet, and for those pursuing graduate degrees, six figures has become something akin to a standard operating procedure. Overall, the national total has ballooned to nearly $1.7 trillion. That's more than outstanding credit card and auto loans in the country. But what did they get for it? The reality didn't exactly live up to the promises, shall we say. The average age of all homeowners in the US is now 59 years old, and even first-time buyers are sitting at 40. Of the entire market, boomers comprise nearly half of all purchasers, a staggering statistic given that they're now between the ages of 61 and 79. Homeownership is starting to look less like an achievable goal for young working people and more like a retirement move. Renting, meanwhile, hasn't exactly spiked either. The share of young adults living with their parents has climbed to levels not seen since the Great Depression, with over half of 18 to 29-year-olds residing in their childhood homes. By all accounts, young people haven't been this locked out of the system they grew up in for decades, and while they hardly seem to be trending in a pro-capitalism direction, they're not exactly running to the left either. So why? And the answer comes down to the fact that one side actually talk to them about it. The right connected economic pain to tangible, visible causes, while the Biden administration was rolling out Bidenomics as a slogan in the wake of some of the highest inflation the country had experienced in decades. Trump, meanwhile, was all too happy to talk about inflation on the campaign trail. He went on record as attributing his victory to the border and grocery prices. Whether or not he had solutions that would actually impact people was far less significant, given the tone-deaf approach from the administration. The pattern held across the pond too. In Germany, the AfD tied economic anxiety directly to refugee policies, while the multi-party coalition in power was spending considerable effort covering climate commitments that, however well-intentioned, did little to address the squeeze people were facing on a day-to-day basis. In France too, the National Rally campaigned relentlessly on the cost of living alongside immigration, while Macron's centrists came across as increasingly out of touch with what ordinary people were going through. Now, the populist right aren't the only ones to have benefited. We've already mentioned guys like Sanders and Mamdani in the US and Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France. And to that we can add Die Linke in Germany and Zach Polanski in the UK. Clearly, the populist left has also received a substantial bump from the collapse of the centre. But for whatever reason, the left-wing bump hasn't been as great as that seen on the right. As to why that could be, well, we've got a few theories. The meaning vacuum. So, we've established that Gen Z's been dealt a rough economic hand, and that they've come of age in an environment where their loudest peers would actively try to silence and ostracize them for not holding the correct opinions. To be clear, most young people weren't part of that vocal enforcing minority. Hell, many of them weren't even political. But until very recently, it absolutely felt that if you were young and didn't hold views on stuff like immigration and trans rights that are socially very left-wing, you could be demonized for it. Perhaps it's no wonder that many people felt pushed away by what they saw as the left. And for some, that pushing sent them to some unusual places. For well over half a century, especially in the United States and Western Europe, each successive generation has been less religious than the one before. By the time the new millennium rolled around, the assumption was that as humanity continued to advance technologically and scientifically, faith would fade, a holdover from a less enlightened age. In attempts to appeal to a younger, more socially liberal generation, Protestant churches across the states and much of Europe began to amend long-held doctrines on matters ranging from divorce to marriage for gay couples to immigration. It may have stemmed the tide, but it didn't exactly catch on well. By the latter part of the 2010s, religious attendance was nearing all-time lows. But lately, it's starting to look like the trend is also being reversed. Back in 2021, belief in God among 18 to 24-year-olds in the United Kingdom was sitting at 16%. A year later, it had ticked up to 19%, quite an improvement. Well, by late 2025, that number has surged to 37%, with one survey even putting it at 45%. That is an absolutely staggering turnaround in just 4 years. Less than 2 in 10 to nearly half the 18 to 24-year-old population. Perhaps even more surprising is what denomination they're turning towards. It largely isn't the Church of England or equivalents seeing the bulk of the growth. It's rather Catholicism, the church that didn't change doctrines on women's ordination, on same-sex marriage, or a whole host of other issues. Of Gen Zers in the UK, Catholics are now reported to outnumber Anglicans by a 2-to-1 margin, according to surveys based on YouGov data. A similar pattern is emerging in the United States, where for the first time in decades, more people are joining the church rather than leaving, and parishes are reporting increases in conversions by 70 and 80% over just a few years ago in certain areas. The converts come from some surprising directions. Many were agnostics or even ardent atheists in years gone by. Keegan Lennion, a 28-year-old convert who went from the atheism of Hitchens to the church, put it bluntly, "My generation is watching things fall apart. Things all seem to be going wrong in greater society." Articles in outlets like the Free Press are now headlining, quote, "How Catholicism Got Cool," and wondering aloud whether American cities are undergoing a religious revival. Again, from young adherents and converts, not older Americans returning after decades away. Now, this hasn't been universal. The US and the UK are two of the frontrunners on this trend, with secularization still dominant across much of Western Europe's younger generations. But something is clearly shifting in certain areas, and the pattern of which institutions are growing is revealing. A similar pattern shows up with Islam. Muslim populations in Western Europe have been growing for decades, partially due to immigration and partially due to high birth rates. But the far more interesting dynamic is what's happening within those communities across generations. Research in France and the UK shows that young Muslims are actually more practicing than their parents, rejecting the secularization theory that future generations would drift away from their faith. This pattern extends beyond just Christianity and Islam, though. Israel has been an even more dramatic example of how this can play out electorally. There, 73% of Jews between the ages of 15 and 25 now identify as right-wing, compared to just 46% of those over 65. And this isn't just nationalism either. They're also more likely to be socially conservative too. Part of this is due to a significantly higher birth rate amongst the ultra-Orthodox, but even here, that only explains so much. For more and more Israelis, the older, leftist history of their country is just that. It's history. The Israeli case study should be particularly instructive given how visibly it's played out electorally. As we previously covered on political fronts in our episode on Israel's far-right problems, there is a genuine rise of extremism on the right that was once classified as religious terrorism, yet today sits in government. Meanwhile, the Israeli Labour Party, the founding party of the state, is nearly non-existent today, holding just 4 seats. It even had to merge with another left-wing party just to survive. As the older secular left has shrunk, appeals to tradition, religion, and nationalism have filled the space. And some of what's filling that space is less than benign. Red alert. When vacuums are created, someone is going to step in to fill them. The only question is, who? And outside of the cases we've looked at today, the alternatives are concerning. In Scotland, a 17-year-old was arrested while planning a mass murder at a local mosque. He had been radicalized by the far-right online since the age of 13, had come to believe that whites were in a race war, and developed sympathies for the Nazi Party. After deciding he wanted to carry out the attack, he began to involve himself with the mosque, telling the imam there that he wanted to convert. Also, he could gain access to the building. Meanwhile, in England, a 15-year-old named Rhiannon Rudd was groomed into neo-Nazism online, constructed a shrine to Hitler in her bedroom, and ultimately took her own life. These are, of course, very extreme examples, but they represent the furthest end of a spectrum that has become way more popular in recent years than most people realize. Further down that spectrum, figures like Nick Fuentes have built an actual political movement out of similar disaffection without the open calls to violence. Fuentes leads what he calls the Groyper movement and commands a following of millions of young men. He openly praised Adolf Hitler as well as Joseph Stalin, somehow conspiring to make that old Simpsons joke about McBain fighting the commie Nazi one step closer to reality. Fuentes' rise of late has been particularly concerning. For quite some time, many believed that banning him from the major platforms, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, you name it, would help prevent his reach from growing. But it has to be recognized that we live in a different age now, where X under Elon Musk, which has since reinstated Fuentes' account, has led him to amassing an enormous following. He live streams freely on Rumble, bypassing YouTube entirely. Conservative writer Rod Dreher recently reported that between 30 and 40% of Republican staffers under 30 in Washington might be either Groypers or Groyper adjacent. While not easily verifiable, even if it was off by half, it would still be a huge milestone for the movement. And then there's the likes of Andrew Tate, less ideological and more primal. He too has been banned for years from the major platforms and is currently facing charges of trafficking and rape in Romania, with the UK prosecutors adding 21 additional sex offences to the list. None of that slowed him down though. According to a 2023 survey by Hope Not Hate, nearly 8 in 10 British boys aged between 16 and 17 had consumed his content, and nearly half of them viewed him positively. A third viewed him as a role model. Tate's appeal rests on a complete inversion of the normal morals of the modern world. Dominance as something of a virtue, flaunting extreme wealth, women as property, and violence as a foundation of respect. While he doesn't have a political movement per se, or a coherent ideology, he nevertheless offers a radical alternative that grants people something nobody else seems particularly inclined to give: permission. He gives permission not to apologize, to take what you want in the world because it owes you nothing and will give you nothing unless you seize it. Now, what he's granting permission to are some of the worst inversions of our moral order that we can think of. But for young men who feel like they've been told their entire lives that they're the problem, that message lands differently than it would have just a generation ago. And the concerning thing is, once people have bought into this alternative worldview, it's really difficult to get them back. Mainstream interpretations just simply fall flat. Conclusion. Alright, so where's this all leave us? Well, one of the most unsettling things about everything that we've discussed today is just how little people in power seem to care. They give speeches condemning the likes of Fuentes all day long, but when it comes down to the issues that are really driving people to support him, they almost always go suspiciously quiet. Now, this does appear to be playing out differently in the US than it is in Europe. Trump's inroads with younger voters are currently looking like they may have been something of a one-time thing. His approval rating has slipped considerably with the group, and as we've covered previously here on Political Fronts and the possible civil war in MAGA, there are real fractures emerging in his coalition that could reshape the landscape considerably, and plenty on the right are already vying to capitalize on that shift. But in Europe, the trend shows little sign of reversing. The parties that were unthinkable a decade ago are now polling ahead of the centre-left and centre-right ones that dominated elections in yesteryear. This is where the uncomfortable question gets raised that neither side of the political spectrum so far seems particularly eager to address. What happens to a generation that was promised the world through a very clearly laid out series of steps, often built their lives accordingly, and still had little to show for it? Whatever you may think of the hard right, it's at least talking to them. In politics, perception is reality. And if you're explaining to voters why they're actually wrong, you're most certainly going to be voted out of office. It seems that lesson has yet to be learned by many. Thank you for watching.